Officials are confirming Vladimir Putin's landslide victory. Officials say Putin not only won 87% of the vote, but he also had the most voter support ever, nearly 76 million voters, because they're talking about 74% turnout. The UK and the EU are both denouncing the election this morning. UK Foreign Minister David Cameron saying the results, quote, underline the depth of repression under Putin. Let's bring in Dominic Velitis, who has more on this. Another angle to the story, Russia's war on Ukraine. We certainly heard Vladimir Putin yesterday, Dominic, immediately look to the war as being a top priority for him in this new term. What are some of the immediate implications for the fighting and for Ukraine of Putin's re-election?
Well, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, of course, provided the backdrop for this presidential election, and Putin will likely use his apparent landslide victory as a mandate to crack on with the war and possibly, some analysts think, even escalate things, maybe up the aggression and increase the tempo of operations there. It's something Ukrainians are certainly contemplating, something they are deeply worried may be about to happen. Now, that does remain to be seen. But as you say, the war in Ukraine was certainly at the forefront of Putin's mind when speaking after those preliminary results came through, suggesting he'd overwhelmingly won the vote, as I should add, was widely expected. Here's what he had to say earlier at his campaign headquarters. Take a listen.
В целом, инициатива полностью принадлежит российским вооруженным силам. И на некоторых участках наши парни их противника просто кромсают сейчас. Продвижение каждый день. Постепенно, аккуратно, но каждый день.
And Heather, Putin also used the occasion to issue a warning to the West, I think in response to this idea that was initially floated by France's Emmanuel Macron, that Western ground operations in Ukraine might be necessary at some point. And such a move, Putin said, could push the world to the brink of World War III, although he did go on to say that he didn't think anyone was interested in such a scenario, as he put it. Incidentally, we've also heard from Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, and he used his nightly address to slam Russia's presidential election as an illegitimate imitation, adding Putin was sick for power and doing everything he could to rule forever. Here he is.
Жодної легітимності у цієї імітації виборів немає та бути не може. Цей діяч має закінчити на лаві підсудних в Гаазі. Саме це ми маємо забезпечити усі в світі, хто цінує життя і порядність.
But as I say, Heather, the war in Ukraine was very much a central feature of this election. And with Putin now in power, it seems, for another 6 years at least, it will, some say, continue to be a kind of organising principle for the Kremlin, and especially for the Russian economy, which is now well and truly on a war footing. That will be a big concern for the West. I suspect Russians, too, are a little anxious today. It has been pointed out that the Kremlin does tend to introduce unpopular policies in the aftermath of a presidential election. That's certainly what history has taught us. And with the war bubbling away in the background, there may be concerns about potentially another military mobilization on the horizon, or even perhaps increased crackdowns on dissenting voices at home. Heather.
Dominic, thank you very much. Bill Browder is with me this morning, financier and political activist, the author of Red Notice and Freezing Order, and the head of the global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, named in honor of his lawyer. Mr. Browder, I'm delighted to have you on the program today. Thank you for being our guest.
Great to be here.
The result in all of this was predictable, but Vladimir Putin has been returned to power with this fifth term. But with that overwhelming 87% of the vote this time, that's his largest margin of victory yet. How do you interpret it, sir?
Well, it's, I mean, you had a diplomat on saying some pretty harsh things about it. I'm not a diplomat, so I could be much harsher. The thing was a complete farce from top to bottom. Putin kills, imprisons, or exiles anybody who's a political opponent. He controls all television stations. He threatens any individual who wants to be in any opposition to him with death. They killed Alexei Navalny, of course. It's an absurdity. And I think the thing that I find most offensive about what's happening today is that some news stations are reporting Putin wins with a landslide. He doesn't win with a landslide. People were voting with a gun to their head. It's absurd.
And so the assertion from the Kremlin that with 74% of turnout and this 87% support, as they cite it, shows Russians consolidated around Putin. That's how they're interpreting. That's their message this morning. What do you think is the true level of public support for Vladimir Putin?
If you had a free and fair election where candidates who all had different ideas could present their ideas to the Russian public, if the media allowed people to go on television and talk about their ideas, Putin would probably be in have 10 or 15% support. I mean, just think about it logically. Why would anyone support a dictator who will arrest you if you say the wrong word about him, who will arrest you if you call the war a war? Why would you vote for the dictator who's been in power for 24 years and has stolen all the money with him and his friends from the country? So there's no roads properly built, there's no hospitals, there's no teachers in the schools. Putin doesn't have anything to offer anybody in Russia. It's an absurdity for him to say he's popular, but this is exactly what he wants people to think. And because there's absolutely no way of measuring it, a lot of people will repeat, look, landslide, Putin's great. He's supported by the Russian people. We may not like him, but they do. But that's just not the truth.
And yet, as illegitimate as you and so many others are saying, this win, he has this mandate once again. What do you think he will do with it? What do you think this next term looks like with Vladimir Putin as president once more?
Well, I think the first thing he does with it is he drafts up another 500,000 young men to go and become cannon fodder in this horrific, murderous war in Ukraine. The second thing that he does is he throws even more resources at the war and starves even more people from their regular lives. The third thing he does is he stands up to the West and tells us that if you get involved, if you oppose him in any way, he's going to set off a nuclear war, or he's going to attack a NATO country, or some bullying thing like that. I mean, now that he's finished this little sort of fake election, he can now go on and do really aggressive stuff that he was sort of hesitating a little bit before to do.
You think this is emboldening, or whatever restraint he had will now, the shackles will be off if they were in any way, shape, or form? I mean, what do you think will be? I mean, you mentioned the first move you suspected was this mobilization, which many in Russia have been very concerned about, of course. What will you be particularly watching for?
Well, the main thing that I'll be watching for is what we do in response to everything that Putin does. So Putin will probably do a mobilization. He will increase his attacks on Ukraine. He will throw more resources into this war. And then the question is, does he succeed in this war in Ukraine? Because and that will depend on us. Do we then throw resources back at Ukraine so they can fight off Putin? Or do we throw our hands up in the air and say that enough is enough, we can't handle this anymore, which is what some people are doing right now? And if that were to succeed, then Putin then goes on to a NATO country. He goes on to Estonia or Lithuania or Latvia. And then we face this terrible choice in the West, because they're NATO countries. Do we honor our NATO obligations and one for all and all for one and go to war with Russia? Or do we abandon our NATO obligations and allow Putin to run roughshod across all of Europe? I mean, that's the world that we live in right now, and that's who Vladimir Putin is. And
the scenarios people like NATO leaders are going to have to contemplate. I'm wondering what the role might be of people within. I want to show some pictures. We certainly saw over those 3 days of voting some pretty extraordinary acts of defiance, with people lighting ballot boxes on fire, for example, and throwing green paint into some of those ballot boxes as well. And then yesterday at that noon local time, the lineups grew to just long queues of voters. Mr. Browder, seemingly in response to what Alexei Navalny had called for just before his death, the noon against Putin. What does that tell you about the state of opposition right now within Russia, and might it curtail Putin in any way, shape, or form?
Well, what it tells you is that any rational person hates Putin, and these are the ones who are brave enough to actually go out, and they're going to use facial recognition software to figure out who these people are and persecute them, to send a message to all the ones who weren't brave enough that you shouldn't go out and do this kind of stuff. And for every one person who is standing in line at 12 noon, there's 1,000 who are sitting scared in their kitchens, having the same feelings, but just not acting on them. And so, I mean, it's all a big pressure cooker. And at some point, it could explode. The trouble is that dictators don't know when it's going to explode. We don't know when it's going to explode. The people of Russia don't know when it's going to explode. There could be a moment when everyone said, enough is enough. I'm not going to be afraid anymore. I'm just going to stand up and do whatever I have to do. And that's the moment that Putin can't control it. He can assassinate people, individuals. He can arrest individuals, but he can't arrest the whole country. And that's where he is vulnerable, is a public uprising. And the more of this repression, the more probable that is. But we've seen North Korea go on for decades with this type of repression.
It's so interesting to hear that. I was going to ask you about this, what you thought about the likelihood of any sort of uprising, or whether Vladimir Putin is president for life, invincible now through another 6 years, and then potentially another 6 years beyond that. What do you think?
Well, he's definitely president for life. It's just a question of how long his life is, and whether it ends abruptly from disease or natural causes, or it ends abruptly from, the Ceausescu scenario, Nicolae Ceausescu, who was the dictator of Romania, where they all rose up and hung him from a lamppost. Those are Putin's two options. He's not going to retire into the sunset and start painting pictures at the Putin Presidential Library. No, he's gonna do this until the end of his natural life, however that life is defined.
I'd like to ask you as well about something you are advocating for and behind, taking the $300 billion in Russian assets, central bank assets, which are frozen now in response to Russia's war on Ukraine. And you have suggested those be seized and then given to Ukraine, and talked about this being the Navalny Act, much like the Magnitsky Act, which you were behind before. I'm wondering, we know that's been problematic largely for EU nations. How much support do you detect at this point for what you'd like to see with that money done?
Well, it's interesting. When I first started proposing this idea, it was like 2 years ago, just after the war had started and after the $300 billion had been frozen. And I was saying, Putin has done all this damage. Why shouldn't he pay for it? And when I first started talking about it, a lot of people were saying, that's never been done before. It's sort of outside the box. It's unconventional. We don't want to do it. And as time has gone on, and as the war has dragged on, and as the damage has increased, and as the number of murdered Ukrainians has increased, the resistance has lessened. And we're at a point now where the UK, David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary of the UK, is now openly advocating for it. Janet Yellen, the head of the U.S. Federal Reserve, the U.S. Treasury is openly advocating for it. And as you mentioned, the Europeans are still sort of sitting on the fence. But we've seen this before. If you remember, we all started talking about tanks and long-range missiles and F-16s for Ukraine. And at the beginning, everyone said, "Well, that's outrageous. We can't do that. They're not a NATO ally, et cetera, et cetera." And as time went on, the idea became accepted. Now, Ukraine gets tanks, long-range missiles, and F-16s. And I think the same thing is going to be true with this $300 billion. It's just a question of bringing Europe over the line. And I think this is actually easier than long-range missiles, because this is just money. It's not, the fear about long-range missiles from Europe was that this would escalate and it would end up in a nuclear war. Now, Putin will be angry as hell if we take $300 billion of his money, but I don't think he's going to start a nuclear war over that.
Can I just ask you quickly what you think the biggest hurdle still is for the EU? I mean, there have been concerns about legality, about precedents for future conflicts down the line, the kind of repercussions that this might set off. What do you think is the one thing that you have yet to get over in order to get EU support on side?
Well, it's interesting, when we talk about the EU, it's not like there's a single person who's
Right.
needs to be convinced. What you have is 27 member states that are all sort of bickering among themselves. And they have to come to a unified decision. And so all it takes is one country. And I would imagine Hungary is that one country, run by a Putin friend named Viktor Orban, who's blocking it. And so when we talk about the EU, it's just a question of how do these 27 fractious different opinions all come into one? And usually what happens in these situations is that Putin is the person who convinces everybody to do the most radical thing back towards Russia by some new outrageous act that he's committed. And one of the reasons why I thought this would be seizing this money in response to Alexei Navalny's murder is that that was an outrageous act that everybody could respond in a similarly outraged way. And we should call it the Navalny Act, and we should say to Putin, you know, your murder of Alexei Navalny just cost you $300 billion.
Mr. Browder, thank you. I hope we'll be able to have future conversations. Really appreciate your perspective as always. Thank you for the time.